A woman and her husband interrupted their holiday to go to a dentist. I want a tooth pulled, she said, and I don't want any painkiller because I'm in a big hurry. Just extract the tooth and as quickly as possible and we'll be on our way. The dentist was quite impressed. You're certainly a brave woman, he said. Which tooth is it? The woman turned to her husband and said, show me your tooth, dear. Sometimes it's easy to be brave, isn't it? And many times it's not. Fear is something that most of us are very familiar with. And sometimes those fears can be a bit unfounded. Don't really make a lot of rational sense. Fear of things like spiders, or open spaces, or even one of the most popular ones is fear of things with small holes in, like sponges or honeycomb. The older I get, the more, I'll confess to you, the more I struggle with heights. For some reason, I have no idea why it's getting worse as I get older. Even if I know that I'm safe, my legs still go weak and I feel all that woozy and horrible feeling. So some fears are unfounded, are irrational. But other fears are understandable, aren't they? Last week, a news report stated that in the UK, 75% of the Muslim community in that country are worried about their safety. 3/4 of people within the Muslim population are afraid. That was after the series of riots that happened this month that were sparked by a false claim that the main suspect in that awful knife attack in Southport was a Muslim immigrant. And suddenly they felt very unsafe. Those fears are understandable, as are our fears when we're afraid of the future, or of unemployment, of ill health, of loneliness, of terrorism, of death. So how can we overcome those fears? What can we do when we're faced with those overwhelming fears? What's the answer? Well, Abram, he had good reason to be afraid. He too was an immigrant living in a very dangerous situation. But God spoke to him in an amazing way. In Genesis chapter 15, it's just one verse we're going to read this morning. Genesis chapter 15, verse 1. And we're just going to take some time to think through this one amazing verse of Scripture. So it says this. Genesis chapter 15, verse 1. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. This verse starts with this little phrase, after this. It points back to what we looked at last week, if you were here with us. If you remember, Abram had just defeated an alliance of 4 kings in a daring surprise attack, and he had rescued his nephew Lot, who had been taken captive as a prisoner of war. And then after that, he refused the offer of the king of Sodom, one of the kings that he kind of rescued, of the plunder of that victory. But it was after this, that Abram struggled with fear. Maybe it was after the surge of adrenaline and excitement that it just struck him what he'd just done. The kind of the shock of the battle. Maybe he was worried about a revenge attack from these 4 kings that he'd defeated. Or maybe he was scared that he'd offended and made a new enemy of the king of Sodom. But whatever the reason, it was immediately after that incredible victory, that Abram struggled with fear. And I think fear is like this. It can hit us at the most unexpected of times. We see that right down through the Scriptures. If you remember, it was immediately after Elijah's incredible victory over all of the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel that he was threatened by Queen Jezebel. And Elijah was afraid. And he ran for his life. In an amazing act of faith in Jesus, Peter stepped out of a boat in the middle of a storm and walked on water. But it was then he saw the wind and the waves, and he was afraid and began to sink and cried out to Jesus. And it was after Paul's amazingly courageous and powerful defense of the gospel in Athens that he moved on to Corinth, where he said, I came to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. And as followers of Jesus, we too can struggle with fear. And it can hit us at the most unexpected of times. And can get in the way of us living the life that God has called us to live. Maybe it's fear of condemnation that stops us from living in the joy of our salvation. Maybe it's fear of failure that stops us from launching out into serving God in new ways. Maybe it's fear of being hurt again that stops us really from pushing into fellowship and opening up our hearts and lives to others. Or maybe it's fear of what people might think of us that stops us from sharing our faith in Jesus. Fear is a common problem. But we don't need to be defeated by it. Into the turmoil of Abram's heart, God spoke. And He spoke personally to him. It says in verse 1, the word of the Lord came to Abram. Now, in the rest of the Old Testament, we often hear that phrase, the word of the Lord came to, as referring to the prophets who received a word from the Lord and they were to pass on to the people. But here, it's just a personal word for Abram. God was speaking to Abram as an individual. God knew what was in Abram's heart. He understood his fears. He knew what he needed to hear. And He called him by name and He said to him, do not be afraid, Abram. Do not be afraid. It's the first time we read these words in the Bible. Do not be afraid. But they're words that God spoke again and again to individuals who were struggling right throughout the Scriptures. To Isaac, Abram's son, God said, I am the God of your father Abram. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. To Joshua, facing an overwhelming task of bringing the nation of Israel into the promised land, God said, be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. To Israel, facing danger and threat on every side, God said, so do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. In the New Testament, these words are spoken by Jesus to the terrified disciples in the middle of a storm on the Lake of Galilee. Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. To a synagogue ruler who'd just been told that his daughter had died. He said, do not be afraid. Just believe. and to Paul, trembling in Corinth, overwhelmed with the task of sharing the gospel with that city, the Lord appeared and said, "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you." God knows the fears that are in our heart. He knows our concerns. He knows our anxious thoughts. He knows the worries that overwhelm us. But this is His personal encouragement to us this morning. However we are feeling, whatever we're struggling with, whatever we feel overwhelmed by, gently, in love and compassion, God is saying to us, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid, because I am, God said. It is because of God that Abram did not need to be afraid. God was calling Abram not to fix his eyes on his problem, nor on the other people around him, nor on himself, but to fix his eyes on God. It was God's presence that would remove Abram's fear. A couple took their kids to this cave, Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. As usual, when the tour reached the deepest point in the cavern, the guide turned off all the lights to dramatize how completely dark and silent it is beneath the Earth's surface. If you've ever been in a cave there where the lights are turned off, it's that darkness, you can almost feel it. It's so thick. And the little girl, suddenly enveloped in that utter darkness, began to cry. She was terrified, but immediately her brother spoke up. He said, "Don't cry. Somebody here knows how to turn on the lights." We may go through some really dark times in our lives. We don't need to be afraid, because we're not on our own in this. We have somebody with us, and He knows how to turn on the lights. He knows how to banish the darkness and bring us into His light. So even in those dark times, we can say with confidence, "The Lord is with me. I will not be afraid." But God didn't just assure Abram of His presence. He also assured him of His protection. He said, verse 1 again, "I am your shield." A few years ago, there was a guy called Carlos. He was waiting in his driveway to be picked up for work, when two guys came up to him and demanded money from him. Carlos said he had none, so these two would-be thieves shot him. Now instinctively, Carlos, he just picked up, or he just lifted up his lunchbox that he had with him and held it in front of him. Just an instinct. And it was his lunchbox that took two direct hits that were aiming for his chest. And although Carlos was hit in his side, his lunchbox saved his life. It took the bullets instead of him. His lunchbox shielded him from the attack. And that's what God promised Abram. Whatever threat that he faced, Abram did not need to be afraid. He had an effective shield to protect him, to come between him and the threat. And it wasn't his 318 trained men. Somebody so much better. It was God Himself. It was as if that God stepped in front of Abram and said to anybody who wanted to threaten Abram, if you want to get to him, you have to go through me first. I am your shield. That's what David wrote about the Lord. He is a shield for all who take refuge in him. If we put our trust in the Lord, if we hide behind him, then we can take refuge in his protection. That's because, as we're remembering in communion, on the cross, Jesus, he took the punishment that we deserved. He suffered the holy wrath that was against our sin, so that we would never need to. He took the hits for us. He shielded us from the death that we deserved. And so we can rest secure in him. If we have trusted in Jesus, then we can rest, knowing, as Paul said, that the Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. What an incredible gift we have. Nothing can get to us without, first of all, going through Christ. We may not be able to see his protection in our lives. We might feel exposed and under threat. But we can count on it. This is what Richard and Margaret Hillis experienced. They lived with their 2 kids in a village in China. They were trying to share the gospel with the people who were living there. They were missionaries in China. It was in the time of the Japanese invasion of China during World War II. And so the village was tense with fear. Every day reports came that the Japanese army was coming closer to their village. And then Richard developed appendicitis. He had to be taken to hospital on a rickshaw. Margaret had a deep sense of foreboding as she watched him leave. Then the news came that the enemy was near, and everybody had to evacuate. But Margaret knew that her 1-year-old Johnny and her 2-month-old Margaret Ann would never survive as refugees. So she stayed put as everybody else left. Early the next morning, she tore the page from her wall calendar, and she read the next day's Bible verse. It said, Psalm 56 verse 3, when I'm afraid, I will trust in you. The town emptied that day. Next morning, Margaret arose feeling abandoned. But the new verse on her calendar was Psalm 9 and 10. You, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. The next morning, when she arose, there were distant sounds of gunfire, and she worried about about food for her kids. The verse on her calendar that day was this: so then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And an old woman dropped in a pint of goat's milk, and another person arrived with some eggs. Through the day, the sounds of warfare grew louder and louder, and during the night, Margaret prayed for deliverance. But the next morning, she woke up and tore the page from her calendar to read Psalm 56 and 9. Then my enemies will turn back when I call for help. Battle was looming closer. Margaret didn't go to bed that night. Invasion seemed imminent. But the next morning, everything was quiet. Villagers started to return to the village. For some reason, the troops had withdrawn. No one could understand it, but the danger had passed, and they were safe. And Margaret says that she looked at her calendar again, and she felt as if she had been reading the handwriting of God. Now, of course, God doesn't always keep us from the difficult times in our lives. He doesn't always protect us from those times of suffering. But He has promised to bring us through them. He's promised to protect us in those times of suffering. The handwriting of God to us says, do not be afraid. I am your shield. But God didn't only promise His presence and His protection to Abram. There's another promise. A promise of His provision. Some translations of the Bible, excuse me, of this last phrase says this, and your reward will be very great. Abram, he just refused that huge bounty from King Sodom. But God promised that ultimately he would not lose out. His reward for trusting in God would be great. It would make everything that he turned away seem insignificant. And for us too, that walk of faith in Jesus can be really costly. Following Jesus does demand of us great sacrifice. Jesus said this, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. The call to follow Jesus is a call to deny ourselves, to deny what we want and accept Jesus as Lord of our lives. Whatever that involves. But although we might lose out in the short term, ultimately we'll never lose out if we follow Jesus. Jesus went on to say, for whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will save it. God will reward us for whatever commitment we make to Him. We will always gain when we lose our lives for Him. Whatever we have to lay aside, we gain so much more. Not that we earn this. It's not a such thing of, it's not a reward that we earn through what we've done. We deserve only punishment for our sin. But this is a gift of grace in our lives. God saves us by His grace. He calls us to serve Him by His grace. He equips us and empowers us to serve Him by His grace. And then, as if that wasn't enough, by His grace He wants to reward us for what we do in service for Him. And this reward should encourage us to serve God wholeheartedly, as Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6. As if you were serving the Lord, not men. Because you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good He does. Everything that we do for the Lord, however small and insignificant, however invisible to everybody else around us, God values that. God sees that. God appreciates that. And ultimately, God will reward that. And Jesus promises that God will reward us in ways that are so much more than what we could ever give up for Him. This is what Jesus said in Mark chapter 10. No one who has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me and this gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age and in the age to come, eternal life. God's resources are unlimited. God's grace is unending. We will never lose out if we serve Him, no matter what it costs us. But of course, we shouldn't expect God to reward us in the same way that we give to Him. God will often reward us spiritually for what we give physically to Him. He will reward us eternally in heaven for what we do for Him in the short time here on earth. In fact, the NIV, if you've got that translation, translates this last phrase of verse 1 in this way. It says, I am your very great reward. This was not only a promise to Abram that God would reward him, it was that God Himself would be Abram's reward. Abram's reward was not going to be financial wealth like he gave back to Sodom. It was not prestige and fame in carrying out this raid, not even the appreciation of his nephew Lot. But Abram's reward was God Himself. James said of Abram, he was called God's friend. God's friend. That was the greatest, the most incredible reward that Abram could ever have received. The best thing that Abram would receive was his relationship with God. The problem in our lives is not that we set our sights of what we want out of life too high. It's not that we're too greedy and we want too much. It's that we set our sights of what we want out of life too low. We set our sights on small things, like wealth, or possessions, or career, or relationships, or respect, or admiration of others. That's too small a prize to go after. We were designed, we were created, we were redeemed for nothing less than the reward of God Himself. Nothing else will satisfy our hearts. Nothing else will ultimately be worth living for. And when we realize that God is our reward, then everything else will take second place. Do you remember what Paul wrote in the letter of Philippians? We looked at that a few weeks ago. I consider everything a loss compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. Everything is rubbish compared to knowing Jesus. That's why we should be willing to lose out in the eyes of the world. That's why we should be willing to turn our backs on what this world offers. Why we should be willing to deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow Jesus each day. Because in losing our life for Christ and His kingdom, we've won the greatest prize of all. We've been given as a gift of grace, friendship with God. So fear, it's a common problem. And it can hit any of us, even in the most unexpected of times. But we don't need to be afraid. If we've trusted in Jesus, we have this personal word of encouragement this morning. I am your shield, your very great reward. So we have this promise of God's presence, of His protection of us, and His provision for us.